data supplier on the DMI framework, a company called Wenfresh. And Wenfresh are the UK's leading provider of residential and commercial property data used by supermarkets, banks, insurers, and other big data users. And we are convinced that their data can expand our mission to be a data agnostic supplier of the best available data to help clients in the public sector. So, but without any further ado, I'll pass you on to Paul Vout of Wenfresh to talk about how property-related data can enhance your assessment of fraud, error, and debt. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk through the slides we moved on, so those people who aren't on Zoom, as Mark mentioned, you'll know where we're up to. So moving on from the title slide, what I'm going to do is just give you a very quick overview of Wenfresh, and then give you a tour around property data as a whole and the sort of typical applications that it can be used for in the public sector, some of which we've had engagements on, some of which are pretty firm ideas where we can see some similarities from the work that we've done before. So Wenfresh itself, so as Mark mentioned, we're one of the leading property data suppliers in the country. We're not owned by a business called CLS Solutions, which work in the conveyancing and insurance space. They're specifically on property as well. They're in turn owned by Munich Re, who are one of the largest global reinsurers. And we work across a range of sectors, as I said, from the legal sector all the way through to financial services, public sector, and sort of capital markets as well. We're obviously ISO 9000, 7000. We have about 150 employees in the UK, but we're also present in Spain, Germany, and Canada, and expanding out over those areas. So without further ado, I'll move on. Let's talk about the data and property data itself. So moving on to slide 3. So what data is available in the marketplace? I'm going to start with the valuation first. It's a key thing that we use in the private sector, specifically for mortgage originations, but has a lot wider application across the piece. So there's 2 main valuation sets that we have. The first one is a sales valuation, and we have a couple of things on that. We've got a capital valuation, an estimated price model, and a survey estimate, and they're predominantly used when underwriting sort of properties for mortgages or securitization of properties as well. But as you can guess, these will have many applications in terms of estimating equity in properties, especially when you're looking at sort of charging, and that's where it's typically used in the legal sector for litigation activity. The second one is rent paid. So we have a couple of sources of data for that as well. We not only get that from listings from the agents, but also we get it from insurers, landlords, insurers specifically, and tenant vetting agencies as well, where they're vetting the individual and they get sight of the physical contract for the let that's sort of happened. There's a pool of about 3.5 million actual rents. Now, as you'd expect with rental, it's something that ages, and in the same sort of methodology as we do the property valuations and sales valuations go up, so do rents. So we not only have the sort of real rent paid, which ages, but we also model that through using the same methodology as property valuation to give a more current rental. And that's done on the basis of looking at similar properties in similar areas down to pretty granular level in terms of number of beds, and even construction types in some cases, to make sure that that's a robust model that we can use. Typically, it's been used across the piece in affordability calculations, where you're trying to assess whether the rent that's been put by a consumer is correct. Obviously, for yield calculations as well, and then sort of other areas where you're looking to see what kind of income that can be gained from rental. So moving on to slide 4. Probably the other key piece which does feed into the valuation piece is transactional data as well. So we've got the information from the main so there's approximately, also a bit down at the moment, there's usually around 2 million moves a year with rental. Can everybody hear me, because my connection's just got a bit unstable? Is it all good? With about another 2 or 3 million rental moves on top of that as well. So we get every aspect of this. This is obviously where we come in with our relationship CLS, one of our owners as well. So we see the conveyancing process, so we understand the move process itself, as well as when a property's listed, as well as when a property's sold under offer, or as well as when a property's rented. So typically we've used this in local authorities to sort of get a heads up really on council tax, so they can see when movements happen. And I think the thing that's been found when compared to sort of the Bureau information in particular is that we don't tend to have a lag on this information because it's not directed by the consumer. When a consumer moves from a property, whether it be a sale or a rental, it's directed by that physical house sale and that process, rather than the customer instructing that data by opening or changing an account at a bureau. So we found in terms of council tax with this that we can be anything up to 6 months ahead, or where people are trying to disguise the date that they've moved in, we have a more accurate date in terms of when that move actually took place as well. So moving on to slide 5. New build and planning commercial data. This is quite interesting again in terms of some of the work that we've done in the local authority sector in particular. We've had a number of instances. We've worked with 8 local authorities at the moment, where we've looked at the territory of the local authority, and we've actually found that to be more properties than the local authority actually have. So what we can do, we can track new builds. That's the first element of it, but we can also see where things have been converted in terms of flats, houses to flats. And we've had a number of instances which have run into the thousands for one of the main city councils, where we found, I think it was around 1,700 properties, which they had a single entity property, single dwellings, which had actually been converted into 4+ flats as well, but they were only charging council tax on one of those, so it's quite useful. The other piece, I mentioned new build as well. We sort of track the development from when the foundations are also laid. So I guess the point again for that with council tax, there becomes a liability on the property. I think it's at the stage that sort of roof's on and the supplies are in. We can actually tell the authorities when that actually happens and when it becomes a legitimate property which can be charged from a council tax point of view. So again, that's something else that's been used by some of the authorities that we've sort of worked with on that basis. Commercial data, again, this has been used mainly to look at undeclared assets. So we can look at businesses and we understand the ownership of the properties and the structures behind that ownership for properties. And it's more than just the sort of first layer, the part 1 of the title deed. We've got tools, and there are other tools available, obviously, where we can drill into the land registry information and we can sort of understand complex structures where the owner may not be declared as the owner, but there are sort of covenants on properties where there is a stake which is owned by a business. So they're entitled to some sort of financial compensation on sale or any process that goes through on that as well. And that's quite useful. Again, we've used that in public sector, but we're also using it at the moment with one of the main banks to look at ownership structures for when they're doing sort of corporate asset restructuring and things like that. So it's quite an interesting piece. We were surprised when we've done the exercise exactly how many businesses do have interest in properties which aren't outwardly declared on the sort of main title deed. It's all in the sort of depth and the detail. So we combine that with SIT code information. We have the company's house information as well, and really bringing those assets together as we do with bureau data and the residential assets as well, really sort of delivers a powerful solution in terms of understanding the property, consumer or business link. So we're moving on to slide 6. Ownership of the landlord. I've sort of touched on this, I guess, with the commercial piece, but we can interrogate the land registry data to quite a detailed level. So as you can see from there, we can get the core land registry information. That would be the ownership structure and the owners themselves. We look at title and plan and that kind of thing. We can also get down to the covenants, the easements, charges, especially, and who the charges are with. Now, I guess again from a bureau perspective, they usually see financial charges in terms of private sector organisations such as banks, where there's a first charge, which is a mortgage. We can see every charge that's been there. So if it's been done by a public sector charge, so one of the government departments or whatever, we can also sort of see that on there and who that's with and when it was applied. The last piece on that, I guess, is the landlord identification. So on every piece of land registry information that you get, there's also a correspondence address, if it's applicable, and that is usually the landlord or maybe even the business which owns multiple properties as well. So we're also able to interrogate that to understand who the landlord is at the address, as well as verifying their ownership on that piece. So that can be quite useful in terms of understanding, again, property portfolios, property to person associations. And again, we've used that in a number of scenarios for looking at undeclared assets and confirming landlords where it was necessary. We had an instance in one of the northern local authorities where we've used that to uncover it was basically a fraud ring on landlords as well, which they sort of successfully prosecuted on the back of. The next part is property attributes. That's some pretty interesting stuff in there, really. So we can look at sort of capacity of properties, as you would imagine. We know number of bedrooms down to even the sort of angle of the roof, which probably isn't so useful, but I'm just trying to sort of explain the detail that we have on property information. You know, drives, gardens, all the usual kind of thing as well, living space, etc. But we can also look at sort of drainage types and whether things are up to specification, and specifically referencing the HMO license in there. We have information on social housing. We have all the HMO licenses in the country, which is regularly updated, and we can provide a prediction model, which I'll go into a little bit later, which can tell you whether a property should be licensed for a HMO as well, which, you know, we're working with a number of authorities on with that at the moment. The other two pieces on there, running costs, we've used for affordability. So we have a view, we've got a database of 21 million bills for gas, electricity, water and insurance, which we use and also model out as well. And that can be used in an affordability scenario when you're sort of looking at income and expenditure. And the final one there is property use and classification. I've touched on the fact we can tell whether it's social housing, but we can tell if there's a business being run from a property. We can tell whether it's an institution, if it's a care home, and all the different classifications which apply to a property itself. So moving on to slide 7. Just to go through some of the use cases here. So where we've sort of applied some of these is in debt management and recovery, specifically litigation. So that's going through the process to assess the owner, to understand the value of that property, to understand any other charges on that property, including the mortgage, and then to calculate an equity position, which would give a view if there's any available equity to put a charge on a property where a debt's in place. Undeclared rental income. As I said, we've used this in an affordability context, but I think there's opportunities here to use that in terms of discovering where people aren't declaring rental property. We've got a rather large pool of rental information which can be accessed as well, and we can also see over a period of time, so historically, that the amount of money which has potentially been gleaned from renting that property out when it's been undeclared. Changing circumstances is quite straightforward. We know when people are moving, we know if they're changing property from, and it's more prevalent probably in the rental situation, really. So if, for example, if somebody's declaring they're living somewhere, we can see that potentially that house is now up for let or up for sale, so their circumstances may be changing at the point they're making an application. Expenditure validation and fraud I've touched on. Pretty much the pool of information we have around sort of household bills, that would be the best way to describe it. We also have a indication of mortgage paid as well, which isn't as accurate as Bureau, but again, we get it from a consumer declared database, which we're permissioned around, which we can put at a household level. Tracing really goes into the change of circumstances piece. So we have done this for a few organisations in the private sector where we've looked at people who are moving who are potentially in debt or in arrears and haven't declared that they may be on the market to go. So it's sort of like a pre-trace sort of element before that trace happens, allowing organisations to contact the individual to ask them if they're just about to have a change in circumstances. Now, fraudulent subletting is another piece, probably geared more towards local authorities, and we have done this with a couple of London boroughs. You will be amazed, or maybe not, how many people advertise a property which is obviously a local authority stock or driven on the main property hubs like Rightmove and Zoopla. So that's just a pure case of taking our data and sort of wrapping that up and matching where that property is being sublet out. And obviously all the other things in the chain go with that in terms of the amount of rent that's being charged, etc. as well. So you can get a good view on how much fraud's taking place effectively. I've mentioned the council tax property stock validation. So again, that's sort of new build when complete and properties which have been subdivided, which an authority may not be aware of. So again, in those circumstances, that's where, you know, additional council tax should be due, where there's individuals who've made changes to properties and put people in there to rent, for example. And we did have a key one with one of the Birmingham authorities. There was a couple where there'd been a change of use as well. So this was an accountancy firm who had actually changed their premises into 11 self-contained flats and not declared that. I think it was a case of probably planning and the revenues people not sort of having the right information between them. So we come across things like that quite a bit when we've done some of these exercises. The unlicensed HMOs I'll go into in a tick. I think I've mentioned the sort of main bit on that, but I'll just illustrate the kind of thing that we can go on that. Change of occupier is obviously driven off our transactional information, so it's very similar to change in circumstances. So we typically know when somebody moves back in as well, just because of change in statuses, and also from a sales perspective, the conveyancing process and when that's complete. Household composition it's a bit lighter, I guess, but again, it's based on capacity of the property. If somebody's declaring the fact they've got 5 people in a 1-bedroom house, I think there's obviously something to look at there, so we can sort of describe what the property is from its attributional status, whether it's got enough rooms or bathrooms or such like. Empty properties and voids, working with sort of bureau providers, we can sort of provide a level of verification or a candidate list of where properties could be potentially empty, especially on the sort of rental side as well, just by the transactional history of that property to see if anything sort of moved on. And I've mentioned the commercial and ownership structures as well. So just quickly moving on to slide number 8, I've sort of described this is something we're actively doing at the moment with local authorities. So if you concentrate on the diagram, just the bottom piece, which leads to the cross, we are actively putting daily updates into local authorities at the moment, looking at the status of properties in their area. And what we can do then is see when a property's gone on the market to let or for sale. We can explain where it is in that sort of process as well and inform the council. So for a couple of reasons there. One is obviously somebody be exiting, but somebody will be moving into that property, and we know when that transaction takes place. And if that's not being declared at the right point in time, the authority can go and do further investigations to get the council tax applied at the right point. I guess from an old occupancy point of view, it's the flight risk piece on there as well, where there's existing debt or any issues with that individual or family in that property. We can tell them that there's a risk that they're going to move because it looks like they've got that change of circumstances sort of coming in there. So as I said, we've got 8 authorities using that, and really as a byproduct of that, we've sort of moved on to do the sort of new property piece as well, because we monitor their area and we throw in effectively any additional properties that they're not aware of in terms of their sort of council tax piece. So how that uses, we get a list of all the chargeable properties that they have, and we compare that to the stock that we have, and any sort of residual that they don't have, we present to them, and they go and investigate to see if there's a council tax liability due on that. So moving on to slide 9, it looks a bit messy and complicated, but I'll explain as we go through. So this is about unlicensed HMO schemes. It's relatively sort of new, and we've been working with a partner on this. But what we can do is, looking at all the sort of the schemes in place, we can tell you what's licensed. We have all of the UK's local authorities licensing, HMO licensing details for every property in the UK. And then we also have a model which looks at various characteristics of properties, and it categorises them into the 3 key schemes that there are for HMOs. The mandatory one, which is obviously 5 beds plus, etc., which everybody has to do as a local authority. There's the additional scheme as well, which you can put in place discretion where you have to consult the sort of area in government to be able to do that, and then the selective scheme, which is for sort of areas of hardship and whatever. So we can identify and classify properties into that for further investigation. And how that sort of typically works is we provide, again, a candidate list of properties which are investigated by the local authority, and they typically sort of go round and do that. The additional piece on this, as I mentioned before, is that we can also inform the local authority where they find and confirm it's an unlicensed HMO, who the landlord is to, by looking at the land registry information that we have. And that comes not only with the name, but typically contact details, whether it be an individual residential address or a company. So we can do that from that perspective. Just to throw out some figures from an actual, this is the London Borough, which we worked on with a partner as well. So there was a business case put together. This has been running for 5 years. Pre-enforcement assumptions, as you can see, around the number of rental properties and landlords, and obviously licensing revenues due, which they thought they could be potentially missing. Now, using the type of data I've just described for HMOs, classifying their area into HMOs, the post-enforcement reality was exactly that. So 50,000 rental properties, 27,000 landlords, and 42 million sort of due, which they continue to collect at the moment. There's a couple of other spin-offs from that, as you'd imagine as well. One being extra council tax, because of the way some of those HMOs were structured and how that was due. But also they worked with one of the government's main departments to inform them of potentially where income tax would be due on rental properties as well. So I won't dwell on that too much, but you can see the type of results that you can get out of that, especially where you put all of those 3 schemes in place as well. The slide before sort of illustrates the kind of revenues that are available for really sort of clamping down on licensing and sort of expanding the licensing structure out. The last case I'll just go to, which we work across both public and private sector, is really the structure around sort of collections and debt management. What we sort of look at, the contact piece I've sort of mentioned about the sort of pre-flight risk type stuff, where we look at the transactional piece where people are moving in properties. There's the affordability section, which people use in combination with their income and bureau data that they sort of receive, where we can look at housing costs. But I think that the most significant element of that is probably the sort of rental value. And again, sort of confirmation of that to sort of compare to what's being declared. And then finally, this is the area we really sort of work in the most across the piece. It's around sort of classifying into owners and renters, and then looking at sort of charging orders from that perspective to look at valuation, equity, etc. But also there's a liquidity element in some cases too, where people have potentially got the house under offer or sold, so you know that there will also be some available cash as well. So it just allows you to, one, inform your strategy in terms of the opportunity to do litigation and charge, but also there's other avenues there where somebody may be moving or somebody may be on the move where they may have some liquidity. All our data, and typically all this data is available batch API. We can put it into a web interface as well, so we can sort of pretty much fit in with any structure. It can be used real time. Indeed, probably 65% of our data is updated on a daily basis anyway through the portals and the conveyancing piece, which we work with on our partners. So that's it for me. Fascinating oversight of an invaluable new sessions. And we, through Indesa, will be very happy to work with any party that's on the line or any of our clients to facilitate wider discussions. So those of you who have joined an Indesa workshop before will recognise the names of Chitel and James, who are the primary contact points for these discussions. Please, if you think of any questions that you think of after the event, if you think any of your colleagues would like to have a rerun of the presentation, then please do let us know. We'd be very happy to engage. Clearly, there was far too much to cover in great detail in the space of just half an hour. So my thanks to Paul. As I said, there's details of our contact details there. The previous webinars, so again, if you have any desire to catch up on any of the previous webinars, we'd be very happy to have a word with you about those. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us today. Other than that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye now.